When I was a kid, some of my favorite books are from this series called Choose Your Own Adventure. And that's that type of book where you flip to a certain page if you make a choice at each critical point. So pretty soon I'd have all my fingers holding the location of each decision point so I could go back if needed, and pretty soon I'd be out of fingers. In this case, it makes you feel like you want to try out every single adventure. It's a choose your own adventure type of case. Welcome to Machines and More. We're going to talk about this guy here, the new NCase M2 that I got a preview of a few weeks ago in Taipei. That was the yet unreleased white finish version, and the one that I have here, it's what's going to go into production right now, and it's going to be available for ordering. This one is the black finish, and there's also a silver finish, which I haven't seen, so I can't comment on that finish quality. But if it's anything like this black, I think you're going to be very happy with it too. So real quick before we begin, NCase provided this case for our review today, free of charge. This video is not sponsored by them. The content produced here is done so independently, and they aren't apprised of any of the review findings until this review's public release. And I aim to deliver objective feedback for your benefit. If you enjoy content like this, please make sure you are subscribed because it really helps out the channel. We got a sneak peek of this prototype. We called it the M1 V2 or M1 Evo V2 back in January, and for the most part this version has retained those changes. The timing of course did get pushed for a variety of reasons, but I'm glad to be finally showing you the case. So I will note the one that I have here is still a slightly earlier review unit. The key parts of this case are going to be identical to the retail version, but there are probably going to be some small differences. For example, the rad and fan panel that I have here is an earlier version, and the one that you get with the retail version will probably be a sturdier one. Since this is an updated version of an existing case, I won't cover in depth on all the features. Instead, I'll just focus on the changes versus the previous M1 Evo, and there's still a lot to talk about. And I'll cover the assembly and build at a higher level, since I will have a more detailed video on that coming out shortly. And that kind of detail is just a little bit too much for the scope of this review. And then we'll also dive into thermal performance. I want to show you what the performance is like with this new cooler compatibility. And then I'll wrap it up with some recommendations. So the M2, it's not being called the M1 Evo 1.2, and that marks a critical distinction here. The width of the case, it actually has changed quite a bit. And the power supply mounting is improved. You have some quality of life improvement. So, perhaps these would be beyond what most would consider an incremental update, so hence the cutover to the M2 nomenclature. But whether it's a V1.2 or M2, this case addresses a lot of the concerns with the previous version, and some of which I had brought up in my initial review. So let's just take a look at those changes. So first off, the width goes from 160 millimeters to roughly 166 millimeters. And that's going to address some concerns related to GPU fitment, namely compatibility with wider cards, especially those that use a 12V HPWR connector. At the same time, that improvement will also benefit the case in that you could deploy a slightly larger 144.6 millimeters officially spec CPU cooler there, where the M1 Evo was officially 135 millimeters. Obviously not all due to the width increase there. So the number is actually a little bit more reflective of the actual measurement now. And for reference, I was able to fit my NOC to a D12 out into here without incident. The official width spec on the M2 is 144 millimeters. You're going to have to take into whatever width you need for the power connector into account though. The length is not really going to be a huge issue in this case. You have 359 millimeters, so that's plenty. And 4 slots of thickness minimum. With an mATX board, that's where you get 4 slots. If you have a mini-itx board, you can shift that so that you can have even more clearance at the bottom. So thickness of the card is not going to be a huge limitation. Probably the biggest limitation is the width of the card. So that's the thing I would focus on. The height of the case, it measures in a little bit taller, 258 millimeters versus to 256 previously. And the length is otherwise unchanged, 366. So this width change and the height change marks a small increase in volume to 15.7 liters. A big change here is the power supply bracket. This is the old one, okay, kind of thin. And there was a way to secure this Evo bracket so that it didn't rock back and forth, but it still seemed a bit thin, especially against how good the rest of the case materials were. And now the new one is a fully CNC aluminum and much beefier. The mainboard panel, as you can see here, it's a redesign. It's still the same idea compared to the previous one, but like the V1.1 revision, it's now a full unibody. And some of the added features here are the additional mounting points for 120 millimeter fans. Previously, you needed a center bracket for the kind of middle part of the 220 millimeter side fans, and that's no longer the case. You actually have 4 mounting holes per fan. Now, the ones in the center are kind of half holes, but they're still serviceable, and that's very nice compared to the previous one. You still get the flexibility of board mounting locations. If you use a mini-itx board, you can shift it up or down as you needed. And mATX boards are fully supported here as well. You also have a series of paired holes over here for the power supply bracket when you have that front mounted. That's going to allow the side of the power supply bracket to attach. There is going to be one optimal position at the top where that bracket can also attach at the front panel as well. And then there's also going to be an optimal position on both ends, depending on whether you're doing inverted or whether you're doing kind of upright classic build. And you can also use this elongated set of rails over here for a side mount next to the motherboard. For the inverted build like I have here, you can also connect the power supply to the front I/O bracket so that you have a connection at the front as well. The one I have here is for an SFX power supply. You still need a separate bracket for ATX, and that'll also fit at the front. So even though I don't have the ATX bracket in my test kit, a 160 millimeter ATX power supply should work even with a longer card. Cable management, depending of course, and from bottom to the tip of the card, I measure about 165 millimeters. So theoretically, there is enough space there. You do have to account for the little power plug height as well, though. So I think it should be fine, but obviously without the bracket, I can't verify just yet. You got a similar front panel here. You don't have material cut away for the power supply mounting anymore. And the front panel is quite a bit heavier and a lot more solid feeling. It's almost 100 grams more. So a big change there. The rear panel, mostly the same weight. The grill section, it's now turned horizontally instead of vertically, and now CNC'd out of this same block. This is now integral now, so you can't remove this section. And so one small negative, I actually don't know how a 92 millimeter fan would mount now, even though it can fit right here, because the holes are bigger than your typical fan screw heads. And even then, I wouldn't want to risk marring the finish there. So not sure how that's going to work. Big change for both the front and rear panels is the way that the threaded mating points for case assembly, they're now integral and they're not on removable parts like the Evo was. That is a lot more refined and a bit more polished here. So one change with the front I/O setup is that you don't have to slot these things in yourself anymore. Now, theoretically, because I actually had to reconfigure these so that they would line up with the power button. So you gotta make sure that your USB-C and A ports are roughly in line with the front button. Otherwise, it's not gonna sit right. I actually had to shift these in a few because they were sticking way out of the box. Finally, the rad panel. This is one of those parts that's going to differ slightly from the retail version because this one I have here, it's aluminum, so it's not the final iteration, and the final retail version is going to be steel, so that's going to be stronger than this. Nonetheless, the big change here is the one-piece construction. So this is the prototype I got before, but it's kind of the same thing. In the Evo, you had these half brackets that were serviceable, but they kind of felt kind of half-baked. And this is one of the things I called out, and I'm glad to see this change here. So you can use this at the top or as a side panel. Of course, you do have limitations with respect to the case width. If you're using it at the top, you really can't move it fore and aft too much. Of course, there are a set of holes over here that, so especially for side mounting, that can kind of help you get some flexibility. There's not too much, but you do have some options. And you do have multiple fan mounting points or rad mounting points on these panels as well. So there's 3 slots on each end, so flexible. You will get only one of these in your standard M2 kit, but I do think users may strongly consider opting for the double panel kit, especially if you're the, well, choose your own adventure type like I am. Side panels are mostly the same, a little bit taller to account for the extra height. And the bottom panel looks great. It actually does away with the recess, so it's now thicker and stronger. And the standard feet for the bottom panel are still going to be those little rubber dots. You can option on the classic M1 feet. And of course, the front and rear panels, they are all, and bottom and top panels are wider because of the revised case dimensions. So when I reviewed the case, I thought the finish quality was good. The M2 feels better. The anodized finish, it now feels even more smooth. And when it's all assembled, the overall appearance here is much more high-end, very premium feeling. Another thing that's premium, before we get to building the case, let me tell you about our video sponsor today. Today's video is brought to you by the FlexiSpot C7 Premium Ergonomic Office Chair. Oh man, is this chair comfortable and supportive, in large part due to the specialized lumbar support section. For one, there's 3 hard settings that you can adjust the lumbar support to. And then after that, it's adaptive to gently conform to your body's subtle movements. It flexes in place to give you the right position. And it's still strong enough to be always providing you proper support as well. In addition, you have adjustable armrests that can rotate. You can adjust the fore aft. You can toggle the height. And you have a height and angle adjustable headrest. Okay, see. The seat depth and the tilt is all customizable on the 20-inch seat. My impression is that you can dial in a very good fit, and on top of that, the mesh construction here, it's breathable while not compromising on the structure. And FlexiSpot's 10-year warranty on the C7 has you covered. So whether you work long hours in this chair or gaming extended sessions or just sitting there looking at your M2, the C7 chair is well suited to a wide range of body types, and this is a great solution to complement your desk setup. So definitely go check them out with the special code here, which I'll also leave in the links down below. If you're looking for something a little bit more affordable, but still with solid integrated ergonomics, the C5 is also a good option to consider. And a big thanks to FlexiSpot today for sponsoring our video. So assembling the case, it's simplified greatly due to the standardization of the hardware. With the Evo, you had a whole bunch of different M3 fasteners that you could choose from, and they, according to the manual, they went in specific places, but with few exceptions here, such as the top panels thumb screws. Now everything is designed around one screw. It's this panhead M3 by 5mm screw, and that's going to make the build process a bit easier to understand. Users can choose either a classic upright build with the GPU at the bottom of the case, or you can do an inverted build like how I set mine up here. And that's actually how the front panel was set up for out of the box. And this will likely be the best option for most users, especially if you're doing a gaming build. You still have a vertical GPU configuration, which is possible, and that's just a riff on the classic setup with an optional riser cable that attaches with the similar foot. It's the same setup as the Evo. The difference between the classic and inverted mode, it's just how you set up the front panel, and you just move this radiator panel bar to the side that's opposite of where you're going to attach the main board panel. There are just a few changes here with the power supply mounting that I wanted to discuss. For the classic mode, the power supply can attach at the front. The top of the case is preferable since that's going to allow you to have a connection point at the front panel, top, and then you also secure it with 2 on the side. But if you do drop it lower, you can, within reason, use some standoffs to bridge that gap and still have that mounting point. The slightly more tricky power supply setup is the inverted one because that's involving the front panel I/O. Now you've rotated the main board and rear panel, so therefore the power supply is going to sit here at the bottom. But because of the I/O being in the way, there's actually not a clean way to make the front panel connection. So the front panel I/O bracket has a hole that you can connect to the power supply bracket, and to do that, it's actually best to set it up all at the beginning and install the power supply, since you have the most accessibility at that point. It really does help to install the power supply first, because otherwise it's really hard to screw it in. And also because of the AC power plug, I had to remove the USB-C pass-through connector on the front I/O panel, which I was not gonna use anyway. The way that part goes together, it's still not the most elegant solution, but it's solid. So you will have to remember, make sure you route the internal AC cable. You do have a few choices, but for most, you will be between one of two positions at the back here, either here or here, and you're gonna have a blank spot, so you just cover the other one up with the nameplate. You have pre-drill locations for the motherboard standoffs. Just place those where you need. They're not labeled, so it's going to take a little bit of experimentation. For mATX, you really do have one choice only, and for mini-itx, you can shift as long as you move the standoffs. For most builds, it'll make the most sense to attach the bottom panel and the rad fan panel, if you're using it at the top, after you've installed all your main components. That way you have easy access to everything from both top and bottom. And if you're using fans, then you're gonna have to use this fan panel, and this can be prepped, and then you just plug it into the motherboard after everything else is set up. And that panel can go at the top, under the top panel. I am running two Noctua Slim fans here, okay? And that's gonna fit with this 4080 Super with still about a centimeter of clearance. That's more than enough to avoid turbulence. One neat thing is that the fans can be placed in a way that they line up to the large cooler fans on the card here, and that's going to allow for very clean syncing up of the airflow. On the topic of fans, one thing to note is that if you're using the standard round feet, it doesn't make much sense to place fans at the bottom here, even if they do fit, since there's hardly enough space for those fans to draw air through. And in a classic orientation where the GPU is at the bottom, you can inhibit your GPU more than just allowing the GPU to pull air on its own through the side panel. And it's marginally going to draw some air to the bottom, but you're really blocking out that space for the GPU for its fans to work. For this build, I'm using an mATX board in the Gigabyte Aorus Elite B650M. That's paired with the Ryzen 7 7800X 3D. I've got a Noctua D12L cooler paired with that, just using the single fan here because that's all that fits with this height. For the GPU, this is NVIDIA's 4080 Super Founders Edition. And to power this build, I'm using the Cooler Master 1100 watt SFX power supply. And this is the out-of-the-box 12V HPWR cable. So one of the reasons to expand the case was to accommodate wider 4000 series cards and the associated 16-pin connector. For example, the 4090 FE had difficulty fitting in the M1 Evo. I think it would fit great here in the M2. The 4080 Super FE that I have here is 140 millimeters wide. And with the standard Cooler Master VSFX 12V HPWR connector, this case is a marginal fit at best because the case panel will hit the connector when you close it up. And it does close, but it's not pretty. And unfortunately, this type of connector, even though it is obnoxious, it's not a typical for a lot of stock power supplies. So be advised, you do need to take into account that power connector size. For 4090 FE, I don't think I have any issue fitting that card. That's 137, so it's 3 millimeters narrower. And just for reference, this connector past the widest point sticks out about 13 millimeters or so. The panels do still close up, and I tested it this way. It is not my preference to have pressure on the connector though. The cable management is still seemingly an afterthought here. I've managed the cables down as best as I could against one of the struts at the rear panel, but it really is not a great way to anchor things in the case. Close it up, just attach the bottom panel with screws. If you're using the fan panel, go ahead and connect the fans, screw that down, then insert these side panels, slide the top panel in place, and you just finish it off with 2 thumb screws. Since this revision will not materially impact AIO thermals, I'm not going to retest that here. Instead, I'm going to focus on talking about the expanded air cooler compatibility in the unofficially fitting D12L here. And let's just take a look at a few of the configurations that you might consider. So I've got my D12L set up as a rear intake here. It means it's drawing air from the back panel in, and that's going to be avoiding the exhaust out of this Founders Edition card because this is a directional exhaust. If you could imagine if this were rear exhausting, this air would come right out, hot air, straight in to the cooler, and that's really bad for CPU thermals. So intaking from the back avoids it. It's for a classic setup, you can do case fans at the top to exhaust, And for an inverted setup, provided you have enough room above your GPU like I have here, you can mount intake fans. Taking a look at the CPU temps first, between classic and inverted, the classic setup will yield better CPU thermals and performance. One thing is that this Gigabyte board at stock settings tends to run this chip quite tame. So don't fixate too much on the actual clocks here. With a little tuning could bring them up, but just let's focus on the trends between the different configurations. So we are comparing different coolers versus the Evo, but in a sort of way, that's the point here, right? Because you have extra room, you can run this bigger cooler, you don't have to run the U9S. The D12L's fan is only running at 1600 RPM here. It's not maxed out yet. And this is just a noise optimized setup. That's what I wanted to do here. When you add in the case fans, 2 here at the top for the inverted and 1 single at the top for the classic mode, things do improve overall, but the classic orientation is still best for CPU thermals. For gaming, the inverted build would typically be the favored setup, especially when you have limited bottom room, like with these feet here, and that definitely appears to work the best here. This GPU is drawing the cleanest air from the top. The 4080 Super runs at about 300 watts board power, so these temps from such a beast of a card at only 1500 RPM on these fans, that's a really impressive result. And when we throw in fans, the inverted mode gets even better. And I would lean towards using this exact mode when setting up this case with a tower cooler. And as you can see, with the classic mode, even with a top case fan, you could get similar results with inversion and no case fans. And so you do get a few degrees better CPU temps with the classic mode, but just like we saw with the multi-core render. But in a GPU limited gaming scenario, this difference, it's largely academic more than anything else. But I think there can be an argument for either mode. Good news is the case easily allows you to choose in just a swap of the fan plate bar, which you actually don't need unless you're running the fan plate, right? And so you can just flip the front panel, of course, keeping in mind the PSU setup is going to have to change a little bit. With the mATX setup, you do give up a few side panel fans, which are pretty important when they're deployed in exhaust mode. A lower ITX board can also be set up with full top fans in classic mode, so you can have top and bottom fans with a mini-itx board. Plus, with the D12L here, the rad and the fan plate actually doesn't work because, you know, whoop-de-doo, it hits the heat pipe tips. If it did work, it would have allowed at least a side panel fan to mount here, despite the mATX board restricting the main board side panel fan, but that's unfortunately not the case here. As with the M1 Evo, I fully expect a mini-itx build to have a higher thermal performance potential than the mATX build, simply because you unlock all the fan mounting points. So positives of this case here: the quality, the product experience, it's leveled up. More sturdy panels, the finish feels smoother, the attachment points, they're integrated now for the case assembly. The use of a single fastener type is going to make things simpler. CNC power supply bracket, rad panel. It's a lot of changes, right? These enhancements actually do address many of the pain points I noted previously. The 6mm expansion will allow for a few wider GPUs, although as I noted, this card as tested has a marginal fit due to this PSU cable. But keep in mind, this would have been downright impossible with the Evo setup, short of doing it as a vertical GPU. So this is a case I would still be happy to run mATX as is, and as you have seen, the thermal capability, it's improved since now you can take this bigger D12L cooler, and I fully anticipate that other cooler brands are going to fill in the gap in the market because 145mm is currently a relatively uncontested height range, so I would expect more coolers to come out in this range. So the improvements are welcome and certainly praiseworthy here. That being said, there are still a few points I'd like to highlight because there are almost certainly going to be more revisions with this, and I'd like to see this level up even more. So one, I phrased it as being clunky in my initial review of the M1 Evo, and some of those elements have been addressed, but it still feels slightly less user-friendly than it could be. Just as an example, the power supply mount, it's beefed up now, and it's great, and it's less janky. You have plenty of side panel mounting points for a front mount, but now for full contact, you are limited to 2 positions, right? You have one for classic and one for inverted. And I would have liked to see at least a few more mounts on the front panel where the PSU bracket can attach directly as well. So possibly a system of small threaded holes on the front. That way you can just eliminate having to depend on the IO bracket for help, or being fixed to that topmost spot, or I guess bottommost for the inverted. The way the users interact with the radiator panel at the top, it takes a little bit of trial and error, just because the holes, they're not all going to be indexed to the same position. They're all going to be, one's going to be 1, one's going to be 2, it's a little bit of guesswork here. And it's not hard to figure out. You can just reference the case panel edges. My expectation here is that there shouldn't have to be guesswork. Since mATX is such a big point of difference for this case, and it's a very big plus for this case, the standoff locations, I think, they could be marked out. A lot of cheap cases actually do this really well. They simply stamp an I or an M on the mainboard panel if users are anticipated to move the standoff location between mini-itx, mATX, or whatever. And that's something I consider doing here, because you have to install the standoffs all on your own. And as an example, I had to line up my board and mark off each of the standoff locations with a permanent marker. And it works, but this is a simple improvement, and it will feel less clunky to have that eliminated. The front panel I/O, it's relatively complete, but I still don't know that the pass-through connector is very useful at the moment, and it caused conflict with the PSU plug, so I had to remove this one anyway. So it's not a big deal were it not for the cutout at the front panel that now it's just a hole there. There's nothing filling it. Finally, I haven't seen the official manual or any official tutorials on this yet from NCase. I know that's rolling out along with the case, but I can't comment on it until I see it. As many of you know, the documentation with the M1 Evo, it's a potential pain point, and I really hope and think they will approve upon that, but I will reserve judgment until I see it. Here's the thing. This case, in terms of compatibility, configurability, it's king. And that's why those minor deficiencies seemed, minor on the M1 Evo, and the M2, it further chips away at those. And this is an even more fantastic case for what it can do. So you have a traditional layout supporting mATX, and this kind of component support and the way things kind of fit together in 15.6 liters. There's really nothing else like it right now. If you are looking to go down the mATX path and you still want SFF, I really would not consider anything else. The great thing about the M2 is the price now, and along with the change to a different supply chain, NCase is going to offer this for $165 US plus shipping. The reference point I got for US customer shipping is $20, so that makes it $185 shipped to the US. You do still have to put it together, but it's slightly more than the Fractal Terra and the A4H2O, and as good as the Terra materials are, this here, it's better, and it does way more things. If you were considering the SFF Meshroom S for the board compatibility or NR200 V2, this case is more, but it's not too much more for the material quality that is basically way out of the NR200's league, and it's also way more versatile. So against those reference points, the pricing is the icing on the cake. I fully expected this one to come in at more than $200, but for a boutique level case with this much capability, $185 shipped is a very good price. For an option, I am told the dual fan bracket version will be only $15 more, so that to me would be a must add on. Again, choose your own adventure type, so this kind of thing is priceless, but you can also admit that you'd be perfectly fine with this setup like this. You could do vertical GPU, not a big change here, just get a riser cable, additional finish, and the angled cut version are going to be rolling out slowly, but for the launch, just the rounded and black and silver is going to be the options. So yeah, I've talked about this a lot. I love this choose your own adventure style of case, and we explored a lot of the M1 Evo configs. I'm going to continue to update the channel as I play around with the M2 for sure. First off, the detailed assembly and build guide will follow. We'll try out some different components in here. So please make sure you are subscribed. If you enjoyed this, please give a like, and big thanks for watching today.